Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are today. Welcome back. We've finished up John F. Kennedy, whose administration was tragically cut short by his assassination. But today we'll move on to Lyndon Johnson, the man who took over after Kennedy. And we'll look at what all he advanced during his administration. Now, there will be a couple of things that we won't talk about. One is the Vietnam War. That is going to get its own separate lecture because it is such an important topic, and it's not really confined to Johnson's presidency. The other thing we will just kind of mention with Johnson is the civil rights legislation that was passed while he was president. Again, we're going to cover that in a completely different lecture where we can really look at civil rights. So today we're just looking kind of at the major stuff other than those things that Lyndon Johnson does as president. Now, to begin with, we need to understand a little bit about Lyndon Johnson and who he was, where he came from. This helps explain his political beliefs. Johnson was born in Texas, and he was born and raised on a farm in a rural community. When he was able to go to college, he wanted to be a school teacher. And he did teach for a couple of years. He actually taught at a segregated school down in South Texas, and he taught Hispanic students who were also impoverished. And the reason it's important to know that is because that experience in his young adult life is going to affect what he wanted to do once he got into politics. What he thought government should be doing, and who he thought government should also be helping. Johnson got elected to the House of Representatives in 1936. He spent several years there before getting elected to the Senate in 1948. He served several important positions in the Senate, eventually becoming the majority leader. The majority leader in the Senate Johnson was a Democrat, so he would have been in charge of not only all the Democrats in the Senate, but as the majority leader in the Senate, he also was essentially in charge of the Senate. The majority leader gets to decide what legislation comes to the floor and when it comes to the floor and how long the Senate will debate it. So he served as the majority leader up until he was selected as John F. Kennedy's vice president. He had run for president in 1960, but of course the Democrats ultimately chose Kennedy, and Kennedy offered him the consolation prize of vice president. Now, once Kennedy was assassinated, this is a picture taken on board Air Force One as it was leaving Dallas, headed toward Washington, as Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office the day that Kennedy was assassinated. Okay? He didn't need to do that. That's not an actual requirement in the Constitution. If the president dies, his office automatically falls to the vice president. But Johnson wanted to do it, and Johnson wanted the media there because he felt it was important for the world to understand that our democracy continues despite the tragedy of Kennedy's assassination. Now, in the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination. Remember, Kennedy is assassinated in November of 1963. Johnson, rather than say, okay, let's take what Kennedy wanted to do and let's keep trying to do it, Johnson instead sought to advance his own agenda and his own goals and policies. Now, he would use Kennedy's death and the sympathy that had garnered to try to advance that legislation. You see here the campaign button from 1964. Johnson at the forefront, but in the background, you see the silhouette of what is supposed to be John F. Kennedy and the slogan, "Let us continue." And Johnson would push a lot of his programs under the idea that, yes, Kennedy wanted to do this. But it's really Johnson's plan. Johnson's plan for America was called the Great Society. Sometimes it's known as the War on Poverty because what Johnson wanted to do was he wanted government to start to provide for those in the United States who were socially disadvantaged, but especially those who were economically disadvantaged. He wanted to make sure that no one in the United States had to worry about hunger or poverty or loss of a job. Now, his Great Society also includes civil rights legislation. As I said earlier, these are going to have their own lecture, so we'll save that. But just to mention a couple things, early in that 1963-1964 period, it did include his support for the ratification of the 24th Amendment, which abolished the poll tax. It also included his support and then his eventual signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But, getting back to the other things that he wanted with the Great Society, he did, and Kennedy had wanted a tax cut, and Johnson felt that that was important as well. That was a way to stimulate the economy, so he got Congress to pass a tax cut. He also got Congress to provide an economic aid package to the Appalachian Mountain region. This includes most of West Virginia, but also kind of the border regions between Virginia and Kentucky and North Carolina and Tennessee, kind of that area. That's the Appalachian region, which is one of the poorest areas in the country, and so Johnson wanted Congress to try to do something, to try to economically uplift that area. Congress would also pass something called the Economic Opportunity Act. This bill created something called the Office of Economic Opportunity. This office is responsible for a large number of things. It helps to coordinate literacy programs throughout the United States, helps to coordinate unemployment services and public services to the disadvantaged around the United States. So they all are coordinated by this one office, but it also oversees several other programs. One of them is called Job Corps. This is designed for young people, late teens, early 20s. You can get a job with Job Corps, and what they do is they send you to different parts of the country, and you perform some kind of activity there. You're going to be working in a school. You're going to be working in a something called a Headstart program. We'll talk about Headstart later. You're going to be working in community affairs offices. You're going to be doing things to benefit whatever community it is you're in. There's another program that's very similar to this called Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA. And same kind of thing, they're going to send you to a place in the country where you're going to be working inside, usually an impoverished community. Think of these two things as the Peace Corps for the United States. We've talked about the Peace Corps with Kennedy's administration, but these are for the United States. There's also something called work study. Work study is usually for college students. You're going to college, but you don't necessarily have the funding in order to be able to do that. And so you can get associated with the work study program. They will provide you money. You're going to go use that money to go to college. But then at the same time, you're also going to work while you're going to school. So they kind of work around your school schedule, but they also give you the opportunity to go to college. Now, he starts this program for the Great Society and announces these things. And you have the civil rights, some of these civil rights bills that are brought before Congress and passed, and he signs. And we approach the election of 1964. The Democrats, of course, are going to nominate Johnson. After Kennedy's assassination, the popularity of the presidency went up. If you think of the job approval ratings of the presidents, usually if there is a crisis, the president's job approval will get kind of a little bump, at least at the beginning of the crisis, especially if he handles the crisis well. And so with the assassination of Kennedy, that's a crisis, so Johnson's job approval automatically got a bump. But through 1964, he was doing things that were popular in government, so the Democrats just really enthusiastically nominated him for his own now term as president. The Republicans are going to nominate this guy Barry Goldwater. And this is important because this starts to show a change in the Republican Party. Okay? With that election of 1960, the Republican and Democrat campaign platforms were very, very similar. Now the Republicans are going to start the process of moving toward the right, moving in a more conservative direction. Barry Goldwater is a very political conservative, and he, as a political conservative, he was afraid of what he saw as the growing power of the federal government and the growing, as conservatives will put it, overreach of the federal government. The federal government has no real need to administer a lot of the programs that it was administering, he would say. He said these should be left to the states or the local communities. And so he attacks things like the income tax. Conservatives generally don't like the income tax, which at that point was also extremely high. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, if you can remember back to the New Deal. Why should the government be involved in running an electric company, especially one that only operates in Tennessee? Why shouldn't Tennessee do that? Why shouldn't a private company do that? He also attacked Social Security, which he felt was mismanaged. He also attacked the Civil Rights Act. He was one of 14, I believe, senators who voted against the Civil Rights Act on the basis of he felt it was not the national government's job to protect civil rights. He still feels it's the jobs of the states. He's from Arizona. I'm not sure he understood what was going on in the South. But nevertheless, he was opposed to it. And so, in all these things, he says that the government has overstepped its authority, that the government is taking power it does not need and should not have. In terms of the Cold War, he also felt that the United States was being too nice with the Soviet Union, that we were not being tough enough on communism. And so he attacked from that way. Now, Johnson and the Democrats, were able to paint him as too extreme. And this is just a fun, little sign that we have a picture of here. The billboard up at the top. In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater. And whoever owns the building put up the banner underneath that in almost the exact same size lettering. Yes, extreme right. They painted Goldwater as too extreme. There is a campaign commercial that Johnson and the Democrats ran. It was only shown once. But I'll link to it in the description of the video. It's one of the most kind of memorable campaign commercials in U.S. history because it does show if you elect Barry Goldwater, this is what's going to happen. And it's called the Daisy Flower Girl or some variation of that. And it's this little girl pulling the petals on a flower. And as she counts up in terms of how many petals she's pulling off, all of a sudden, at the end, someone starts counting down and a nuclear explosion goes off. I'll link to it in the description, in the video description. Because Johnson is able to portray Goldwater as too extreme, Johnson is going to win in a landslide. And I show you the electoral map, and if you understand electoral maps, you know that because of the winner-take-all system that exists in the states, Johnson could win, let's just pick on Texas. Johnson could win Texas 51-49, but get all of Texas's electoral votes. In this election, Johnson wins with over 60% of the popular vote. That is almost unheard of to have that many individuals voting for you. Okay? And because of that, Johnson says, look, the people, because of the people's great support, he took that as a mandate to go ahead and continue with his Great Society programs. A mandate is something that politicians will use. They will say, because the people support this so much, we as the government will address it, and we must address it, and they will put their weight behind it because they say, look, the people are supportive of this. Okay? And some politicians take that, with, look, I won 51%, that's a mandate. That's not really a mandate. A mandate, you need overwhelming support. Kind of like Johnson and his popular vote in 1964. So what we're going to do here is we're going to round out the Great Society and go through some of the Great Society programs. We'll start with some of the big ones, the health and welfare programs that exist, and you've probably heard of these. They're constantly in the news. The first one is Medicare. Medicare is a health insurance program for elderly Americans. You're eligible for this when you turn 65. It kind of goes hand in hand with Social Security. The idea behind this was, as people get older, they start having more medical problems. And that's just a fact. Your body starts to wear out. And because you're at retirement age, you no longer have an income. And so if you haven't saved up money, all of a sudden your healthcare costs start to go up. And so the idea here is that the government can help control some of those costs. Medicaid is a companion program along with Medicare, health and medical assistance for low-income individuals and their families. Again, healthcare is expensive. And so the idea behind Medicaid is you have families they don't have enough money to pay for their own health insurance. And they can't afford necessarily to go to the doctor all the time. And so the idea behind Medicaid was if someone gets sick and they don't go to the doctor, it could get worse. Now they're in the emergency room. The medical bills are way more. And the hospital is going to have to eat that cost or pass it on to somebody else. So instead, Medicaid provides health insurance for low-income individuals. So when they start to get sick, they can go to the doctor and hopefully take care of it early. There's also something called the Child Nutrition Act. This established the school breakfast program. Here is LBJ's past affecting his Great Society programs. The idea that he saw students who didn't eat breakfast, that he had to pay for their lunch because he knew that might be the only meal they got during the day. Okay? They would also, under the Child Nutrition Act, they would expand the school lunch program. The school lunch program already existed, but they would expand it to cover more people and be available in more areas. In education, there's something called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And what this was government aid to public schools. Most public schools base their budgets on the tax base in the area. Texas, as the example, we have our local school districts who they raise taxes from the local area. They're supposed to also get funding from the states. In many cases, not just in Texas, but everywhere else, it's not necessarily enough. And so you can ask the state to raise taxes. You can ask the local entity to raise taxes. But sometimes that requires an election. Politicians, they may have to run against those tax increases. And so this was a way for the federal government to send money to districts. There are also special programs within the Elementary and Secondary Education Act designed specifically for schools, not just districts, but also schools that serve low-income areas and neighborhoods. So your district can be, let's say wealthy, but you have one, let's say elementary school that happens to be in a very impoverished neighborhood. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act allows federal funds to go to that school, and so, the district may be giving it plenty of money, but because they're in the impoverished neighborhood, they may need more. They may need to offer more programs, and they can do that with the federal money. There's also something called the Higher Education Act. This, of course, applies to higher education, college, and so this was aid for college students, more student loans, more grants that they could take advantage of. For our littlest kids, there's something called Project Headstart. Headstart is a preschool program for families that are low income. Okay, preschool is, the pre-K that maybe you attended. Back in the 1960s, those were all private. There was no pre-kindergarten in a public school. Okay, pre-Ks were all private, so they were expensive. If you could not afford to go to pre-K, well, you just didn't go. But what did they do in pre-K? They taught you your letters, they taught you your numbers, maybe started the process of how to read. And so next year, when everybody hits kindergarten, you get kids that are already at that point. They know their letters, know their numbers, they know the basics, and you get kids coming that couldn't afford to go to pre-K that didn't. And so they're starting out kindergarten behind. And so Project Headstart was a way to make up for that and hopefully get everybody at the same level when they hit kindergarten. Rounding out here at the end, some of the other major Great Society programs, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'll cover that more in the Civil Rights Notes. There's also something, many of these are self-explanatory here, the Water Quality Act, providing better quality and cleaner water for communities in the United States. The Clean Air Act, which started the process of, setting some of those emission standards for businesses and automobiles. There's also something called the Highway Safety Act, which started federally to require safeguards in automobiles and on the highways. It also provided some training for first responders, EMS, and police when they arrived on the scene of an accident. Lastly, there's also something called the Housing and Urban Development Act. This one is government programs that help finance and build public housing and more affordable housing, again, for those who are low income and in poverty. Now, what were the results of Johnson's Great Society? To be perfectly honest, they are mixed. You have mixed results. Some of them were successful, some of them were not. Some of them are good, some of them are, I would say, mismanaged. Okay? Some of the programs start out pretty well, and they start locally, and hey, this works, this is good, and then let's expand them nationwide. And they expanded too quickly, and because of that, there was red tape and there was more bureaucracy than maybe there was help. Because of that, in some ways, they are less effective than people hoped for. Medicaid, for example. A friend of mine is a doctor, and as part of her medical degree, she had to take a business class because many doctors run their own practice. And in her business class, they were told, do not take more than 30% of your patients on Medicaid. Because the federal government doesn't give you enough money when you provide services. They don't provide you enough money to pay for that. And if you have more than 30% of your patients on Medicaid, you will not be able to earn enough money to keep your practice open. So Medicaid is great. Those people can go to the doctor. But if the doctor won't take you because they already have too many Medicaid patients, it doesn't work. Same with Medicare. Medicare will only pay a certain percentage of the costs. And so my father, he went to the doctor one time and he had to get a electronic stimulant machine. And the doctor said, well, you're on Medicare. We'll just bill it to Medicare. And he said, fine. And they said, what we're going to do is we're going to charge Medicare. And it was going to be something like, $200. And at the end of the month, my dad got a bill for $200. He called the doctor and said, I thought Medicare was going to take care of this. Oh, yes, but they're slow. Don't worry. They're going to take care of it. My dad's the kind of guy, he doesn't like getting a bill. And after he got bills for 3 months and the doctors kept saying, don't worry, it's in the system. Medicare is just really slow. He asked him, he said, okay, what if I just pay cash right now? And the doctor's office said, you're willing to do that? And he said, yeah, just forget it. Take it off Medicare. I'll pay you cash right now. They said, okay, that'll be $120. Because that was the real cost that they had to recover. Medicaid wasn't going to pay them the $200. They were only going to pay the $120. So they had to inflate the cost that they gave. Okay? So some of them failed to control costs. Okay? Medicare and Medicaid are good examples of that. Others were limited or altered. The school lunch program. has been altered so many different ways, so many different times. What qualifies as a good lunch? What doesn't qualify as a good lunch? What do you need to feed the kids? How do the kids respond? I remember watching a group of kids one time. They were required to pick up a fresh fruit, and the school had bananas, and the kids were coming out of the school line, and there was somebody there at the end, and they said, "You have to pick up this banana. We are required by federal law to give it to you." And so many of the kids would pick the banana up because they couldn't get out of the lunch line without it. And as they walked to where they were going to eat, they would walk by a trash can and they would throw the banana away. That is wasteful. But the federal government says, look, everybody's got to have access to the fruits and vegetables. Okay? Now, there are some that are beneficial. Okay? Those kids that do not have access to a good meal at home, they get hopefully some good nutrition, at least for one meal at school. Okay? They can get the free lunch. They can get the reduced cost lunch. This is a good thing. This is a good thing. Please do not think it's not. The assistance to go to college. Me personally, I fear for student loans. I fear when people take out student loans. There are reasons why. If you have me for economics, I can explain it to you there. But there are so many different opportunities people have to pay for their college that, besides student loans, that are good things. Okay, so some do continue to be beneficial, but ultimately, the point of the Great Society was to eliminate poverty, and we still have poverty with us. And maybe you can be a glass half full kind of person. Well, if we continue the programs and if we tweak the persons, maybe we can eliminate it. Maybe you're going to be a glass half empty person. Somebody is always going to be at the bottom. Somebody's always going to be impoverished. But that doesn't mean that we need to leave them out. Okay? Poverty does continue to exist, but it doesn't mean we have to look at them and say, you know what? Tough luck. So, there's your results of the Great Society. I hope this is giving you some information, and I hope you understand a little bit more about Johnson and his administration.